Yeah, so first thing first, Laurent, you can call me Lo, because that's a hard one for you guys. Why am I here today? In a short story, I used to work next door, and Phil has been wanting an Avalanche presentation for years, but we couldn't make it happen because we were busy in the winter. And my boss next door was like, hey, that's a good one for you, rookie. And I said yes. In the meantime, I changed job. I now work at the Peru mine doing the same thing. And I just got off the bus. So I will probably do a couple of mistakes, pronunciation mistakes. Feel free to teach me my mistakes. I'd like this to be interactive. I know there's supposed to be a 15-minute question period. But yeah, do we have to be done at 1? No?
That's fine.
Amazing. But interrupt me whatsoever. That's fine by me. So, it worked, the switch here.
Make sure you're just clicking in the PowerPoint.
Oh, I can see it switch here.
Oh, I'll have to do it here.
Yes. So scope of the presentation, the basic knowledge of avalanche phenomenon, terrain morphology, avalanche terrain morphology, the life of a snowflake. So that'll be very basic, but that's the interesting part. And all this will lead us to better appreciate the complexity of the avalanche phenomenon. And of note, I will not get into backcountry safety because this is a complete other topic, and the basic course is usually a 2-day course, and we only have 45 minutes, so we'll barely scratch the iceberg. Nice. All right, so avalanche, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is a mass of snow, ice, or rock falling rapidly down a mountainside. Obviously, we'll touch here the snow avalanches, even though they all fall into this definition. They all agree, dictionary.com, it also means the sudden arrival of occurrences of something of overwhelming quantities, so you can have an avalanche of email. That's not what we'll talk about. And it's a French word. I had to point it out. That's it. So when we talk about avalanches, this is usually what we think of. Massive catastrophic event. Fortunately, they're very rare. As avalanche workers, this is kind of our nightmare. We definitely don't want to see that. And yeah, these are very rare. So mostly when we talk about avalanches, it's more a little slide, which also falls into this category. More common, this is more our goal as avalanche worker, as in avalanche control. We try to trigger avalanche often, so we reduce the mass and we get little avalanches. And oh, I wanted to go back, but whatever. Not like the one I just pointed out, which would close the road or destroy buildings and have catastrophic. I'm looking for my word.
Consequences.
Thank you very much. So, we'll go through this one by one, but what we're interested in when we talk about avalanche size is their potential destruction capabilities. So there's 5 sizes. Most of you, I'm sure, know this, but the only really way we can quantify this is by the mass of snow that's going down the mountain. And I want to point out that it's a logarithmic scale of 10. So a size 2 is 10 times bigger than a size 1, and a size 5 is 10 times bigger than a size 4. So it's size 5 is basically monster. All right, size 1. Tiny little slides. Its mass is 10 ton, around about 10 meter. It's armless, doesn't hurt us. I made some little maths because when we talk about sizes are relatively harmless to people, what does that mean? So 10 tons of snow, the average mass of snow, density of snow, of wind pack snow varies a lot, but we can average it to about 250 kilograms per cubic meter. So that would be 40 cubic meters of snow. So 40 cubic meters of snow, if we talk about a slide that's about half a meter deep, it's a tiny slide. It's 10 meter by 8 meter by half a meter deep. So maybe the size of this little square here. Then 10 times bigger, the size 2. That's where we start. The rule of thumb is could injure or bury someone. And now we're now at 100 tons, so 10 times bigger. What is 100 ton? It's 400 cubic meter of snow. And that would be, if I made the math, 40 by 20 by half a meter. So maybe twice the size of this class by half a meter deep, just to give you an idea. In terms of engineering, we have thresholds, and not only there is the mass, but there is the force in kilopascal, kPa, I suppose you guys call it. And 10 kPa would be enough to push in a door, by example. So enough to hurt myself if I try to push in a door. Size 1 is 1 kPa. That's enough to break a window in comparison, just to give us ideas more than numbers. Size 3, so 10 times bigger once again, 1,000 ton. That would be 100 kPa. That's enough to uproot a mature spruce as a comparison in terms of pressure. In terms of size, I made the math once again, so that'd be, if we want it a little bigger, so a meter deep, 100 meter by 40 meter. It's a big chunk of snow going down the hill. This is a photo from the Alps, and it's huge. We can't see, I'm sure there's ski tracks on there. I could see them on my computer as a reference. But we had one this year in Shames. It was a bit bigger than 3. It filled up, it was almost the whole thing going down.
Can we just ask, was that the slide that was like Geronimo Matterpods?
Yes. Yeah, I think they gave it a 3.5. It's all open to discussion, really. We look at, how heavy is that? Really, we don't know. But if you try to extrapolate from the depth, width, size of the thing, the amount of snow at the bottom, you can give it about a mass, right? Size 4, now that's getting into the catastrophic events. Could destroy a railway car, a large truck, several buildings, up to 4 hectares of forest. 500 kilopascal is, yeah, you could destroy a forest. And in terms of size, to give us an idea, once again, that'd be 40,000 cubic meters of snow, of wind-packed snow, and 400 by 100 meter by 1 meter deep. So the size of the block here, going down the hill. Size 5, sorry. Then it's really rare. It's catastrophic. Obviously, you need the terrain for that, because the amount of snow that's going downhill is huge. So places you can get as class 5 are very limited. You need a big mountain. It's basically the mountain going down, all the snowpack. 1,000 kilopascal as a reference is considered enough to move a reinforced concrete structure. So if you got a building, no more building. The one we heard about, avalanche in Italy a couple of weeks ago that destroyed a resort. The whole resort was found last week a couple meters further downslope than it was, so it moved the whole thing. Would probably classify for a class 5. To trigger those amount of snow, it's usually earthquakes that trigger those. We had Afghanistan just got hit by 2 meters of snow in 2 days, and they buried a couple village, from what I heard. That would classify as class 5 probably, we're guessing here. And that's basically, in terms of size, it's a whole mountain. The whole aspect is going down. And this one here, it's in Peru, 1970. That's way more than a class 5, by the way. I got the stats here, I looked it up. Next slide actually shows another picture. Found out information on the NOAA website. 1970 in Peru, it was triggered by an earthquake once again. So to trigger those amount of snow going downhill, it was induced by a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. Went down from the Mount Huascaran. It traveled over 16.5 kilometer. So the whole from there all the way there. They estimated that when it hit the village, it was going at a speed of 200 to 300 kilometer per hour, and it killed 20,000 people. So, and it consisted of ice, earth, picked up a bunch of mud on the way, rocks. So it started as a avalanche up top, dragged a bunch of glacial ice, mud on the way, and made it all the way downhill. So that's probably the biggest avalanche ever recorded in our history so far. And they estimated the mass to be about, well, the size of the deposit to be 50 to 100 million cubic meter of water, mud, and rock. So it's, comparison to a class 5, it's quite a step up. Hopefully, obviously we don't have the terrain up here to see anything like that. I know class 4, we see a couple per winter usually in BC, so we have the terrain for that. Some winters there's none. Bear Pass has the potential to create class 5 avalanches. If the biggest slope in Bear Pass went down and carried a bunch of ice on the way, you would, yeah, that'd be catastrophic. We'll see lots of snow and ice on the road, and we'd be digging for months, or weeks I should say. So that's just our classification in Canada. And now, what do you need to create an avalanche? So there's many, kind of like that fire triangle. You need 3 things. If you remove one of those, there's no avalanche. So you need a slope, steep mountain. You need unstable snow. We'll get into this later. And you need a trigger. If you got weak snow and a trigger, but it's flat, no avalanche. If you got unstable snow and a slope, but no trigger, it stays on the slope. Okay? Sounds pretty easy. So the slope. So that's gonna sound stupid. The avalanche happens when gravitational force becomes greater than the friction force, obviously. So if you're, obviously the friction depends on the type of snow. Wet snow have a rest angle, or slush have a rest angle of 15 degrees. And if you're talking about really dense snow that's been packed down by wind, or very well settled snow, it can go up to 60 degrees. And wind can plaster snow on a wall. So it's very variable. But where most avalanche happens, 38 degrees, that's the magic number. So that's where you reach a perfect balance between low friction, and so it's still rest, it can stay there, but with a trigger you're right on that threshold. So 38 degrees is the perfect number for slab avalanches, big chunks of snow that have pretty strong cohesion that will go down as a mass. And lower angles, depending on the literature we look at, see these guys say stuff's at 20, here they say 14. And like I said, slush is a variable term, but the more water content, the lower the angle. It's very rare to see an avalanche on a 15 or 20 degree slope, but if it's very wet and it's very heavy snow, it could happen. You can't rule it out until you're at 10 degrees. So basically, it can happen on like, not much, but it's in very extreme consequence. Extreme, or very rare, just say.
I think it's important to have that 38 degrees is kind of the perfect skiing angle as well.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
It's not very steep and it's deceiving.
Yeah, 10 degrees, you're not having fun.
Yeah. But
38 degrees is when it starts to be fun.
Skiing.
But we don't want to talk too much about skiing.
No, I'm just saying. Some people
But good
think
point,
if-
good point.
Some people think at 30 degrees that they're not
Yeah, because
in a dangerous place, but
you know, it could go up to 60 degrees. 60 degrees, it's like, oh my god, we're skiing this? It's steep. And 15 degrees, it's like, it's the bunny hill. literally.
And Laurent, slides are rare at a steeper angle because
The
is
snow simply
constantly-
doesn't stay on it,
Yeah.
right? It always avalanches, it
Yeah.
sloughs, as we say. So you will never build a mass to have a big avalanche. It constantly avalanches, and since they're so small, we basically neglect them. It just doesn't stay, always comes down. So it's really around 30 to 50 degrees, that's where you're gonna build the biggest mass that can be close to its threshold and that have lots of destructive potential. Trigger. That sounds so obviously a skier, we think of ourselves as the trigger. So we're the artificial triggers. Skier, snowboarder, snowmobiler, explosives, that's in a controlled environment when everything goes well. We trigger it before other artificial triggers. Natural trigger could be extra load, so precipitation is the most frequent one. People think of precipitation as snow, but it can be rain. Rain is a big factor because often we get into that wet snow, and that's where we're going to get avalanche at lower angles. So that's where you get tricked by rain. Wind transport the snow from one side to the other, create extra load. So even if it's not snowing, you can scour the snow from one side, bring it to the other side. And if it's snowing and you got moderate wind, you can triple or even times 5 the amount of precipitation that we're seeing somewhere else. So not much accumulation on one side, tremendous amount of accumulation on the other side because of the wind. Rapid warming, sun or frontals, that means a frontal system or graphic lifting. So if there's a warm front coming on, even if it's not sunny, the temperature might rise really quick, and that's enough to trigger the slope. Earthquake, so like the Huascaran avalanche or in Italy, that was triggered by an earthquake. Or cornice fall, so a big chunk of overhanging snow that falls on the slope might be enough to trigger the slab underneath it. The takeaway home from that is that snow has plastic behaviors, so it can accommodate extra load. As long as you bring it slowly, it's gonna take it. If you put a load rapidly, the deformation rate of snow is gonna increase and it's gonna break. You're gonna reach that rupture point. So like Play-Doh, you can move it around, but at a certain point you're moving it too fast and it just can't keep up with it. It breaks. So that's what we're looking for when we look for loads or rapid warming or lots of snow. Snow profile. Unstable snow, that also sounds very basic, but snow with little corrosion or no strength. We're gonna look at this later on in snow metamorphism, the life of the snowflake. But not all the snow is the same, obviously. Here's an example of a profile. So when we dig, we gotta record all this for if something happens. This is our proof that we did our due diligence. We looked at the snow. Just a quick, what's in there. All these little signs represent the kind of snow crystals we're looking at. Their grain size, so what's the grain size of those snow crystals? Is it dry or is it wet? The D represent dry snow. The red line is the temperature, so we measure the snow temperature throughout the snowpack. The snow temperature is really influences the snow metamorphism. I'll get into this later. And this little step diagram is the hardness. So engineers look at us laughing because we give it a 1 finger or a 4 finger. This is what those, so this is ice, K for knife hard, pencil hard, 1 finger hard, 4 finger hard, and fist hard. So we push in the snow, and if we get it resistant with my fist, well, it's harder than my fist. If I can put in my finger easily, it's a 1 finger snow. So when I look at that profile, I see that we got top to bottom, increasing resistance, it's hard to snow, and then we get here at the bottom, and we get into less resistant snow, which is an indicator that it probably doesn't have much strength or much cohesion. I'll get into this later, but I can point those out. This really hard layer there that goes to pencil, that's a crust. The little round is for rounded grains. This is for decomposed forms. New snow for rime snow. And that's for facetting rounds, and that is for facets. Okay, we'll get into this later. The classic avalanche terrain. This is a simple terrain, just to outline the classic morphology. The start zone at the top, exposed to the element, to the wind. This is where you're going to get wind transport. This is where you're going to get those triggers, where you're going to accumulate the most snow. It's the steepest part of the terrain. And then it eases out. Avalanche is triggered up there, start zone, goes down to the runout. So usually the runout is a little less steep, but it can be steep, but it's usually just not where it's going to get started. Usually we'll pick up snow in the I said runout, I wanted to say track. This is the runout. So start zone, track, runout. Lower angle terrain, the runout is where the avalanche is going to slow down and eventually stop. They talk about terrain below 15 to 10 degrees, but that's very variable. Depends on the roughness, the amount of trees, what's above, if it's funneled or not. But it gets more complicated than that. So we're gonna, Canadian Avalanche Center actually came with the, oh, no, not yet. We'll talk about this later. Wind effect. Actually, hey, I think we passed a video.
You can switch that up. Which one did you want?
Oh, right there at the snowpack. If we come back to the snow profile, there was a little video called snowpack layering.
One moment.
Made by
Mother Nature creates layers in the snowpack. Each different snowstorm has slightly different properties, and then sometimes we grow particular kinds of crystals on the snow surface. So each of these different layers, whether they fall out of the sky or form on the snow surface, they then evolve over time and create these different layers within the snowpack.
huge factor. We can start by the video, actually.
Patterns with how the wind affects the snow as well. So try to get a handle on where the wind is coming from and how it's deposited on the terrain you're traveling through.
Something to keep in mind about wind, lots of times if you read the bulletin it talks about certain aspects to be careful of, which is really important. That's key information. Prevailing wind is a funny thing though, because southwest wind prevails up high, but there's always what we call local wind effect down here. So when you get down to this level and the wind comes ripping through here, what it's doing is funneling its way around all these terrain features. So you can't necessarily use just a general wind direction as a measure. You got to feel each one and figure out the wind patterns of the local terrain that you're working through.
Indicators and clues on the snow surface can tell you which direction local winds are blowing, and that can tell you which way the snow is being transported. Just take a look at the drifts. You can see which way the snow has been drifting overnight. You can get a look at which way the fresh recent cornices have been built. You can feel it under your feet while you're walking up and changing different aspects and get a feel for how the snow is loading on the terrain.
Windward terrain is a slope that faces directly into the wind, so the wind presses right into it. and oftentimes strips the snow from it. Leeward terrain is terrain that's on the other side of the wind. So the wind often slows down and deposits snow on top of it. So it's on the back side of the wind.
Fetch areas where the snow is collected, moved by the wind, and put into the lee area. The fetch area just on the other side of that corner, just over my shoulder, is stripped of snow. And not 3 meters further into the lee, the snowpack could be up to 3 meters deep.
The classic version of wind loading is the wind comes over the ridge and deposits it on the other side. But what's most common is cross loading, and that's when the wind blows across a slope and loads it at a variable depth across the slope. So that's a really easy place to trigger an avalanche because there's a wind load and there's variable depth on the slab. So you really got to watch out for cross loaded terrain.
They talked about Leaside. This is a Leaside, so downside of the wind, and scouring. This is where into the wind. That's if you're perpendicular to a ridge, for example. And you can also get cross loading. So you're going to take, instead of being from the summit, it's going to be from a ridge, which is going down like a rib. Like I said, wind can, if it's snowing, it can increase the precipitation amount on the lee side of the slope to up to 5 times. So if it's snowing 10 centimeters, you might get 50 centimeters of snow on the other side. Scouring, it's big. Even if it's not snowing, it can rip it out from the surface, literally erode it, and deposit it on the lee side. When I talked earlier about the density of snow, and my examples were for wind-packed snow. So just like you'd see in a river with sand, you have it's going to transport around those particles, and the 3 way it's going to do this is by turbulence, so it can be stay in the air, it can be by saltation, so it bounces, get a bit of air, bounces somewhere else, or literally by rolling on the snow surface. You're gonna, and this will break down the particles, so our nice stellar crystal is going to get beaten and get really small, and eventually it's going to get deposited on where there's no more wind, so where the wind decreases. It's a basic sedimentation rule called the rule of Stoke. It's quite an easy one to remember. And it says the faster the fluid, the more its capacity to move heavy particles or big particles. So on this side of the ridge, you got increasing wind speed because of the obstacles here, venturi effect on top. It literally has the power to move big amount of snow, heavy particles, and as soon as you're on the other side, the wind dies, so it doesn't have the power anymore to carry those particles, so they just dumps it there. And in this case, if you got strong wind, you can literally take all the wind from one side, bring it to the other side. So it's not even a thumb rule of 3 to 5 times the amount. You can take it all from one side and put it all to the other side. In terms of another thumb rule we use is we classify the winds from low, moderate, high, and extreme. And we usually consider the best wind transport speed is low to moderate, because it will break the snow down, but it's still a very light particle. So it won't, if you have strong to extreme wind, you're gonna basically sublimate that snow. You'll create so many friction on the snowpack that you're gonna evaporate that snow or have the power to bring it to Saskatchewan, for example. So even if it's really, really strong wind, maybe we're not moving that much snow, we're just taking it away completely. We're not depositing it on the other side. For rapid warming, or another effect on the snowpack, the solar aspect or solar effect by radiation. So it's all about the angle, like I wrote here. South aspects are literally perpendicular to the radiation of the sun. So the amount of energy per surface is greater. It has the power to melt the snow, even if it's minus 15 degrees outside. If there's no wind, there's no turbulence, that air is going to warm up really quickly and you're going to melt the snow. So you can walk on a southern surface, on a southern aspect, and on a 10-degree slope, it's still dry snow, and then whoop, you get that little steep section, and just that little steep area, which is facing the sun, it's going to be melting. So it's very localized, and it's really influenced by the wind. Because if you got wind, that wind's going to cool the snowpack, and it's going to counter that effect. Of note as well, obviously we think about sun, we think about the south aspect, but where a day starts cool and it ends up warm usually. So even if east aspect and west aspect get the equivalent amount of radiation from the sun, because the west aspect is later during the day when it gets that radiation, the air is already warmer. The warmer aspect will be the south and the west aspect. The east aspect might get as much sun, but because it's already cooler when it sees the sun, it doesn't have the potential to melt as much as the west aspect. And north aspect, well, they literally don't get enough sun to melt usually. Elevation, that's a given. The higher you go up, the colder it is. That being said, we got pretty little mountains, so we don't see much of a difference. But if you go in the Alps or in Everest or in the Himalayas, for example, the average rate of cooling, the lapse rate of dry air is 6 degrees per kilometer. So, if you at base camp of Everest at 5,000 meter and you go to the summit 3 kilometer higher, it's going to be 18 degrees or more colder. Moist air has a lapse rate, cooling rate of 10 degrees per kilometer. So, like we see here, over little mountains that are 1,500 meter high, it's not much of a difference. But on bigger mountain ranges, it's a huge difference. So you might be cooking and melting snow at the bottom, but it's actually really cold on top. And here's a little diagram. So if you're near melting temperature, it might rain at the bottom, at the base of the ski hill, but it's snowing on top. We see this all the time. And which is probably happening now. I haven't looked it up, I just got here. But when we're in high pressure, like we have right now, we usually have inversions, so it's basically the opposite. It's warmer above than it is down here. It usually happens when there's very little wind, so there's no turbulence created by the wind. The snowpack loses its energy, it cools the air, and that air literally sinks at valley bottom, like at the bottom of a pool, and you're gonna accumulate all that warm air at the bottom, and the cold air at the bottom, and the warm air is gonna stay on top. So that's the theory behind it. And that's that can trick us. You can be in town here, it's cold, but you go to the ski hill and it's nice and warm. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say earlier when I was talking about the morphology. To help us out, they often talk about the exposure scales. So Avalanche Centers came up with a little rating for us to understand what we're getting into: simple terrain, challenging terrain, and complex terrain. We'll go through this right now. So often we're in the mountains, we look around us, we're kind of tunnel vision. That's an easy slope, but we don't see around. There might be overhead hazard that it's hidden somewhere. So you gotta step back and look at the big picture, which is what they did for us. So simple terrain, planar slope, low angle, not a lot of, same aspect. It's very straightforward. You should expect the same conditions from the top to bottom, more or less. It's a pretty simple quiz. Then you get into challenging terrain. Usually it gets more complicated. It's not planar. You might have more difficult route finding through there if you want to stay on safe terrain. You might have some terrain that's in the sun, some that's not, some overhead hazard. Literally a bigger challenge to stay safe on those kind of terrain. And complex terrain is literally the top of the scale. Multiple avalanche path, different aspect, often glaciated, so there's now glacier problems in there, crevasse. You can have complete different snowpack on this side to this side. It's really a more complex question to know what you're getting into. So that should be a part of your assessing if you go in the backcountry. All right, they devised, also our Canadian Center devised the avalanche characteristics. So they created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 avalanche problems. So they basically, I'm not going to go into all of those, but the main one are loose avalanches and slab avalanches. There's wind slab, created by wind, wet slab, if it's moist snow, storm slab, means it's recent and it's just after a storm pretty much. Persistent slab, it's because there is a persistent weak layer. We'll talk about this later. And loose wet, loose dry and loose wet is basically snow that's got no cohesion, that's really weak, and it's kind of a domino thing. And cornice fall. So we'll go through these really quick. Oh, I think I've hit the bunch here. Perfect. So the slab avalanche, big chunk of snow, leaves a crown or a fracture line, flanks, stock wall, which basically where the chunk of snow has to overcome the snow below it. And these are the more deadliest one, the one with the biggest mass of snow usually. And these are the one that we see around 30 to 45, 50 degrees slope as they rip down as one big mass of snow. Just a famous picture. You can see again on here the crown. The whole thing breaks like an eggshell. It's a slab. It's a cohesive portion of the snowpack that slides as one as a big block. Here you can see the slab has to overcome the snow that didn't move. That's the stock wall. And this guy actually skied out. Good skier.
How deep was that slab?
Well, we can try to estimate. I don't know if this guy's 1 meter, 1.80 meters, let's say. So that would be a feet or 2 feet. I don't know. We're trying to guess. Does that make sense? Oh, I lost my thing here. Okay, then loose avalanche. Basically, it's a domino effect, little snowballing, characterized by the upside down V. So you get a little lump of snow there, probably from that little cornice, fell down. As it rolled down, it just entrained a bunch of snow. They're usually not the biggest because they start as a little and get bigger. They can get big if you got the terrain for it. You can start on a really big hill and go on for quite a while. It's going to be quite a mass of snow. This, though, is a really good sign of rapid warming. And it could also trigger. That could be the trigger for a slab avalanche that's lower down. So if this starts to roll and snowball, creates a lot of weight, maybe that could be a natural trigger for a bigger avalanche. Cornice fall. Another famous picture. See that one everywhere. I don't know what the source is. I guess they didn't want to put their name on that one. Don't do this at home. And here's a picture of, there's a chunk. There was some cornice here. They're all at the bottom now. It is wind-packed snow, so it's very dense snow. And when it falls, catastrophically, it's enough to trigger an avalanche. They are very hard to predict. Really, sometimes it's easy to say, oh, well, it's going to rain for the next 2 days. They will probably fall. They're going to lose their strength. But they sometimes just fall by themselves, and there's really they don't give any hints, or you don't know. And the way they form, that's a good, you can see how all this thing is layered, and this is steeper. So we suspect the wind comes from this side here, and as it passes the ridge, it slows down. As it slows down, it loses its capacity to carry snow, and it creates a bit of a trampoline, of a diving board. And then this thing's going to sag with time, and then it creates that depression again. and layer after layer, the thing gets heavy, and because of this plastic property, it sinks like this, and it can grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. If they don't break, they're gonna get humongous, but most of the time they get brittle and they'll fall before they look like this. At one point, like this one, it's kind of supported, you know, like it deforms so much that it's touching the slope underneath. Sometimes you'll see a big void underneath them, and they're really just big, overhanging mass of snow. So you want to stay far from those. All right, now that's the cool part. The life of a snowflake. Cool pictures. I got most of this information from snowcrystal.com. He's giving away all his pictures for education purposes. There's many different classifications of snow crystals. We say snowflake, but really the good term is snow crystal. FYI. We don't use that much in the avalanche industry, just because there's no reason for it. But Inuits apparently have more than 100 words to describe snow. They live in it. Makes sense. We, like I described in the other profile earlier, we usually divide them in about 10 categories, not even, and there's subcategories if we further want to describe them. I'll try to stay structured because we're going to get into some thermodynamic stuff. They form in the atmosphere. We know that. And that's interesting, you know how we say there's no snowflakes, none of them are the same. It's basically because they don't take the same path through the atmosphere. Therefore, they all go through different atmospheric characteristic, which influences the way they grow. And there's a little video, like a Christmas video, from microscopic snowflakes growing. It's very pretty. I think we should. The atmospheric conditions, they might grow faster, slower, but since the same snowflake follows the same path, all the branches are alike, or they should be more or less symmetrical. They form in the atmosphere in super cool temperature, which means, or super cool state air, which means you're about 50% above saturation of vapor. So it's really cool, way past the saturation point or the dew point, but they need a nucleus to start on. And then as soon as they hit that nucleus, which is usually like dust or whatever, then they start growing around it. They usually start as a as a little plate, hexagonal plate, because of the molecular properties. H2O's got a 60-degree angle, and then they grow from there. Once again, snowcrystal.com, that's a very basic. It's obviously more complicated than that, but this relates the humidity level and the temperature. So you can have dendrites at warm temperatures and cold temperatures. It really just depends on the humidity level. And they mostly all start as plates. You can see the plates through the whole range of temperature. And then depending as it starts falling, it's going to go through different layers of air, and that's what's going to influence the shape of it. One thing that is really, I find interesting anyways, is that it is extremely, the state of a snowflake is basically very unstable. It's stable in the atmosphere where it grows in its super cold environment, but as soon as it gets out of this environment, it's got too much specific surface, too much surface per weight ratio, that it cannot sustain itself. So as soon as they hit the ground, they start changing. And that's where the complicated stuff happens. So as I said, they're not stable at all. Once they hit the ground, they're going to end their life either as glacier, so this is the most stable form of ice we know, or as water. So the metamorphic processes once on the ground. The most important one is by far settlement. We're going to talk about all these, then rounding and faceting and melt freezing. So I talked earlier about the density of snow. Wild snow, that's a weird term, but it's basically snow before it touched the ground. So snow while it's in the air is basically nothing. It's 10 to 30 kgs per cubic meter. So that's not much. And then with time, with settlement, overwhelming weight of the snow above, they're going to get crunched and break into each other. They're going to start changing. First, they're going to lose their branches, because that's the most important and stable part of the snowflake. We'll talk about this a little later. And that's where I got my numbers, depending on the literature, and it's very variable, really. It depends on the spin, the wind speed, and all this stuff. But the average wind toughened snow is 200 to 300 cubic meter, kg per cubic meter. Fern snow, neve, so on a snow that melts and freezes, we see during the summer, we call neve, can get up to 700, and glacial ice is 850 kgs per cubic meter. So it's still way less than water. So snow falls like that, then once it touches each other, all those branches create contacts with each other, and this is where we're going to create or lose bonds. When we talk about how strong the snowpack is or how cohesive it is, that's why. So, as soon as it touches the snow, it starts changing. What drives this change is definitely, like I said, settlement's the more important, but the next one, it will either round or facets, and this is where we get into some thermodynamic stuff. We take for granted that the ground is always at 0 degrees Celsius for geothermal, from its geothermal energy. So even if it's frozen, it's more or less at 0 degrees Celsius. And the top of it is the coolest part of it. It's often a lot cooler than the ambient air because it's evaporating all the time. And to sublimate that snow from solid to vapor, it needs to lose, to become vapor, it needs a lot of energy. So it loses a lot of energy at the surface to let that snow evaporate. So often we're gonna have, let's say, -10 on the top and 0 on the ground. And the only way we can, and really what drives the metamorphism of snow is the vapor pressure. And vapor pressure is directly a function of the temperature gradient at the temperature. The warmer the temperature, the higher the vapor pressure. So, and the only way we can measure that in the field is by measuring the temperature. That's our only thing we can look at. So we talk in the snow industry about the temperature gradient, which really relates more to as the vapor pressure gradient, which is what drives the metamorphism of snow. So, and these processes, obviously, the stronger the gradient, the more it's what will influence if its facets are round. But these are a lot more efficient at warmer temperature, simply because vapor pressure at minus 40 is basically 0. That's the water vapor capacity, but it's a direct function of water pressure, of vapor pressure. So if you got a strong vapor pressure at a strong temperature pressure from 0 to minus 5, it's still going to be a more efficient metamorphism environment than minus 30 to minus 35, even though you got that same 5-degree gap. Is that clear? Yeah? Okay. So rounding or faceting. I'll try not to trip here in my explanations and not gotta understand it myself. But rounding and faceting usually happens at the same time. Within a snowpack, it's warmer at the bottom. Snow is a really good insulator. So often you're gonna find those strong temperature gradient, vapor pressure gradient at the top of the snowpack, and at the bottom of the snowpack you might not have those same gradients. So at the bottom of the snowpack you might be rounding snow, but at the top you're faceting snow. And depending on the time of the day, this temperature gradient is gonna change quite a bit. So during the day you might be rounding snow crystal, and then at night you facet snow crystals. And it's all a question of balance, and it's always evolving. It is really unstable. It doesn't want to stay as a snow crystal, as a snowflake. And so rounding, I'm gonna draw on the board. Can I do that? So if we got snowpack here and same snowpack, same temperature, minus 10 here, 0 here, minus 10 here, and 0 here. Temperature gradient is a lot steeper here than it is here. Okay. And basically, because it's warmer here, we got a higher vapor pressure than here. And that's what's gonna drive the vapor out of the snowpack. It's basically that pressure gradient. And then in that same place here, you got the same difference in pressure, but over a longer distance, thank you. So that gradient is not as strong. So the pressure will basically leave the top of a snow crystal, and it's gonna go up and freeze on the next crystal on top. And it's a constant flux of vapor from the bottom to the top. And it's the most stable state of ice, like I said, is glacial ice. It's really dense ice. And there's a basic concept in crystallography, can I say that in English? That says the more, if you want a crystal that's really well organized, it needs the time to form. So all those molecules can arrange themselves very well, and there's no irregularities in the crystal. So if you got more distances, not as sharp of a gradient, those molecules can go find a good spot to go freeze, if I can put that right. I like the analogy of like we're playing musical chair, okay? And we're 50, and all of a sudden we take one chair out, no big deal, there's just one guy that's gonna lose the chair. We can all sit down, nice and easy. When we're 3 and there's only 2 chairs left, we're in a rush to sit on that chair, and we might just sit on the end of it. And that's exactly what's happening in there. Crystal leaves there, and then he can't even move or go very far, and he's being told, whoa, 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 we're already saturated here. And he's gotta freeze at the first thing he touches. So you're gonna create those hollow crystals that are called facets. And if you got that lower gradient, you're gonna form those round, nice rounded crystals that are nicely filled and they're solid and round. And those bounds, we think usually of the snowflakes, but I'll come back one slide, 2 slides, 3 slides. But those molecules might actually go freeze right there, not only right there. So those branches disappear, and then the vapor crystals go where they can have the biggest contact surface to the next crystal. So they're gonna end up bonding each other and creating really strong bond as they're rounding. And if you're faceting, which is the opposite right there, you're gonna form crystals that are cup shaped, and they grow as cups like this. And they grow this way, because the vapor goes this way, and then as soon as it touches something, it freezes, and they create layers like that. And this is weakening the snowpack, faceting. And you can distinguish them while we're looking in our loops and our magnifying lens by the sharp edges, facets, and by the round edges, rounding. At its extreme, you're gonna form depth pore like this. You can see the striations on them. They're really brittle. They don't touch each other at all, almost. They got really weak bonds, and they can go really big, like massive. It's really rare. You're gonna see this like in the Arctic, where you got really thin snowpack and extremely cold weather, driving those temperature gradients. But the bigger the crystal, the more difficult it is to change its states, right? So once a crystal is big and it's weak, it's gonna be hard to get it to round again and become strong. Do you guys follow me? So when we talk about persistent weak layer, I said that earlier, it's usually big crystals. The bigger the crystals, the more persistent they are. So our persistent grain forms are facets, depth pore, and surface pore. I'll get into surface pore later on. So yeah, the thumb rule, as I said, the only way we can have a look at this processes in the snow is by measuring it, and the rule of thumb is more or less of a degree per 10 centimeter. So if it's the temperature gradient is more than 1 degree per centimeter, we say it's a strong temperature gradient and it's faceting. If it's less than a degree per 10 centimeter, it's a weak temperature gradient and it's rounding. And melt, freeze, crush, that's oh, yeah, there it is. It's pretty easy. On the surface, the snow melts, water is created, it goes filled by surface tension, it goes fill in between the grains where all the pores are, and then when it freezes, all those grains are pulled at once and it creates a nice crust like this. Solid, it's basically ice with some snowflakes within it. And surface pore, it's very pretty. It's probably forming right now around here with the clear skies. They're usually big crystals, as you can see there. Therefore, they're persistent. They're really hard to alter. So they're gonna last in the snowpack for quite a while. How they form, this is the next slide. Like I said earlier, by evaporation, the vapor leaving the snowpacks really cools down the snowpack, and the snowpack is usually colder than the ambient air. And at night, the snowpack is quite colder than the ambient air, and it's losing, on top of that, it's losing by radiation. There's no clouds on top of it. You need clear sky to form surface pore. And it's losing all its energy by radiation, and it's cooling even more because it's not bouncing back on the clouds and getting this energy back. So the snowpack gets really a lot colder than the air around it, and it's going to be colder than the dew point of this air. Therefore, the air, which carries some humidity, touches the snowpack, and it reaches a precipitation threshold. It's going to create frost, and it's going to grow from the snowpack. So some people think it's from the humidity of the snowpack, but it's actually the humidity of the air that freezes on the snowpack. and they grow upward. There's a couple different, there's feathery, there's needles, there's some cup-shaped surface ore. It all depends on the temperature. But they stick out like this. And they're like very precarious little snowflake. And then snow can fall on top of it, and they're all a bunch of dominoes on the slope. And they persist, and they create caustic, weak layer. We don't see them often around here. I shouldn't say that because we got a couple layers here this year, but it's very unusual. You will see this more further east in the Kootenays, for example, than Columbia's. And what can be even trickier is that if you get some valley clouds, you got clear sky, you got all the ingredients for surface ore formation, creates an inversion sometimes, and then the warm air at the bottom of the valley can carry a lot more humidity than the cold air on top. So you're going to create valley clouds. And because there's more humidity here, right around the valley clouds, you have the clear sky above, the humidity source, and it's basically right there at the very precise elevation band that you're going to find the biggest well-formed surface ore. So sometimes surface ore are not just all over the place, they're just at one place, which make things a little more complicated for forecasting avalanches. Any questions? All right, so this is just kind of a recap picture. What influences the snowpack? The sun, precipitation, rain or snow. Canopy cover influences the wind of speed. Wind, elevation, and all this is kind of easy to understand on a flat surface, and it all makes sense. But when you put it in 3D on a mountain with different aspects, different elevation, it is extremely variable. So it's quite a complex puzzle, and you got to keep track of all those weather events and characteristics to actually become with an accurate avalanche forecast. Because the snowpack is different on one side than the other, on top, at the bottom, depending on where you are from the wind. And it really, the spatial variability of the snowpack is endless. So, as an avalanche forecaster, we got to keep track of all this and try to have a mental pictures of this in our head. And it's sometimes overwhelming. But that's the puzzle we deal with. And on top of that, snow is probably one of the most unstable thing known on Earth, one of the weakest things. It's constantly changing. So it's a game of guessing, educated guessing. So it's quite difficult and complex to know where and when they're gonna happen. That's it. Thank you. And there's a bunch of reference at the end. Any questions?
For the stalwarts here, thanks for sticking around.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry to be late again. Not my fault.
Thanks again, Laurent. We couldn't let you get away without some a gift from UNBC, and the cold weather one seemed appropriate.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the scarf. Thanks again for coming.
I will.
It was very informative. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't drown you in the information.
Absolutely. No, it's snow physics, not just observation.
Yeah,
Very
no,
good.
that's where the fun is, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.